I'd like to welcome you all to our first of 3 sessions on intensifying reading intervention. We're going to be focused on a tiered approach, and we're so glad you're joining us this evening. We'll first start by acknowledging that ONLIT's work does take place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. I'd like to start with some introductions. You will have 2 hosts this evening. My name is Una Malcolm. I am the English project lead for ONLIT and the Chief Academic Officer of Dyslexia Canada. I also am a part-time faculty member at Mount St. Vincent University. And I am thrilled to be joined by Ines Bijl. She is a special education consultant at the Waterloo Region District School Board and a fabulous member of our ONLIT team. If you have dug into the B3 continuum section on our website that focuses on syntax and grammar, you may have seen some of Ines's work, and she also has been really leading a lot of the syntax and grammar work in the grade 9 Think SRSD cycles. So thrilled to be able to work with Ines across this session, and really looking forward to digging into this important content together. In terms of our plan for this evening, we've got a couple of things that we are going to focus on. We'll first start by setting the context for this series. As you know, we meet 3 times to discuss this content. So we'll set a bit of context, establish the importance and the why for why we're all here together to talk about this content. And tonight's focus really is on setting up an introduction to how we might intensify instruction. We'll walk through a framework that we'll use for across our time together, and I will pass it over to Ines to highlight what this looks like in practice. So you'll hear from both of us this evening. And as we wrap up, we will have some time for question and answer as well. You might also see our wonderful colleague Laura Bross in the chat, so she will be navigating that. So any questions that you have, please feel free to put in the chat, and Laura can answer some or collect others that would be better served to discuss live. Okay. So with all that being said, let's start by digging into some really important context. And as you know, the title of this webinar indicates, our topic tonight, our focus tonight, is intensifying within a tiered model. And this is something where a tiered instructional model is so deeply connected to our work in Ontario. I know there are also other people joining from outside of Ontario, many other provincial curriculum documents, instructional guidance documents, and broader policy documents also really emphasize the importance of instruction within a tiered model. Now, this quote comes from the curriculum context of the 2023 language curriculum. And you'll see here that the ministry highlights that a tiered approach to instruction is a proactive, preventative model. This is a really key piece that really resonates with me, that importance of recognizing that when we structure our instruction using this tiered model, we are working to proactively prevent reading difficulties from happening before they become entrenched and have all of the downstream impacts on a student and their family and sort of the broader elements. So we're thinking of tiered instruction that is proactive and preventative, and really designed to provide timely support. This is something where we'll highlight some of the key themes from the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Right to Read inquiry, but really emphasizing that importance of early intervention in doing the heavy lifting of supporting students' needs before reading difficulties become so entrenched. We know that a tiered model really focuses on early intervention as well as later intervention, but recognizing that importance of timely support. And this support is so critical for all students in order to prevent literacy difficulties from developing. This element, again, is critical. We are thinking of proactive, preventative systems that can use strong instruction, evidence-based instruction to prevent reading difficulties. Now, you will often see a triangle graphic used when we are referring to tiered instruction or to MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. And it's this triangle that symbolizes the tiered delivery model of flexible additive layers of support. We know that all students in a system, in a multi-tiered system of support, received research-backed instruction. And the goal of this instruction is to act preventatively. It's something where we know that this strong core instruction, tier one instruction, is the backbone of a multi-tiered system of support. This is low cost, high effectiveness instruction serving as primary prevention with the goal of reducing risk as much as possible. This really is such a key element of our systems. However, we do know, though, that some students won't be successful just with this instruction. And in this case, students can receive Tier 2 intervention in addition to, not instead of, their Tier 1 instruction. This is more targeted small group intervention since these students need accelerated progress. They need to move faster than their peers to catch up. And we know that a few students will need Tier 3 intervention or instruction in addition to their core instruction. This is very intensive intervention for students who are significantly at risk, and the goal of this instruction is to close the gap as quickly as possible. Now, you will often see percentages allocated to these tiers. This is something that is often visible. And what is really important to highlight is these are, rough estimations, but they can often be misinterpreted. Sometimes these percentages can be misinterpreted as being an indicator that only 80% of students will be successful or will become readers. The important thing to recognize is that in these preventative systems, the goal is for 100% of children to be readers. And our responsibility as educators and as the adults who serve students, our responsibility really is to highlight what works and how we can support those students with their learning. It's worth also stating that within this tiered model, we're really mindful that movement within the tiers between Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 and back, movement is flexible and not dependent on a referral-based system or a psychoeducational assessment. Instead, we want movement through the tiers to be dependent on data-based analysis from assessment that focuses on how students are responding to their instructional context. We want to be able to provide instruction as quickly and as flexibly as possible so all students can be successful. Now, in order for these systems to be effective, this tiered instruction, there are several system level pieces that are important to be in place. And you can see that I've highlighted several of them here. You'll hear these concepts across our series together. So you'll notice that that tiered instruction, that provision of those flexible additive layers of evidence-based instruction really sits on top of several key factors, including a school-wide assessment system, data-based decision-making, collaborative problem solving, and of course, the piece that helps all those pieces happen, professional learning. And this is one of my favorite quotes that I use often. And while I recognize our series is on intervention, I couldn't let that happen without sneaking in a little bit more of a plug of really focusing on core instruction as well. You can see here Burns and colleagues highlights that building intervention programs without maximizing the effectiveness of core instruction results in overtaxed intervention providers and severely diluted intervention programs that have little hope of providing the intensity of instruction required. And it's these pieces that we really want to draw your attention to, this idea that tiered instruction and the ability of tiered instruction to meet the needs of students rests so heavily on a lot of those key system factors. So you'll see here, I've highlighted elements of an MTSS, of a multi-tiered system of support. And while tiered instruction, implementation of effective evidence-based instruction is certainly a key element, we do know that also there are other additional key factors, including data-based decision-making, collaborative problem solving, how we respond and talk and make decisions around our data across teams with shared leadership across our teams, and using data from school-wide assessment systems. So what I would highlight is this idea that while we do tend to focus a lot on tiered instruction, we do need to be mindful of all those system-wide pieces that are necessary for that tiered model to be effective. And this was something that in the Right to Read inquiry, the Ontario Human Rights Commission specifically dug into. We'll chat a little bit more about that later on, but you can see here a quote from the report. You'll remember that the OHRC, or if you're not yet familiar with the Right to Read inquiry, the Ontario Human Rights Commission did work with 8 representative school boards. So the OHRC looked at their data, looked at what was happening within those systems. And what they found, this is a quote from the report here, they found that all 8 school boards that were audited in the inquiry, they reported using an RTI or MTSS framework to address reading achievement and provide interventions for struggling students. As I mentioned, these approaches are so common and we see them across Ontario and beyond. However, the OHRC also found that despite boards highlighting that they provide tiered intervention for students who need reading intervention, they did find that boards are not structuring tiered interventions in a way that is consistent with effectively implementing RTI MTSS systems. So despite these being such a common element of many board and provincial policies, we're not seeing that happen in terms of how they need to be structured to allow all students to be successful. And this was a piece that the Ontario Human Rights Commission really dug deeply into. Reading interventions was one of the 5 core benchmarks that the Commission examined and looked into. And while it's beyond the scope of our time tonight to go through in great detail, I did want to give a little tiny bit of context in terms of what the OHRC found and what they recommended, because it certainly connects to a lot of our core work this evening and in our next 2 meetings. So the OHRC highlighted in looking at the research of what works for reading intervention for students, they highlighted that interventions work when they are early, when they're evidence-based, and when they're fully implemented and monitored. So they emphasize that to intensify instruction successfully to meet the needs of our most vulnerable learners, boards really should include several key components, including evidence-based instruction at each tier, as well as universal early screening with valid and reliable measures, and evidence-based interventions, both early intervention for students who are beginning to show risk, as well as later interventions for older students who still have pervasive gaps in their foundational literacy skills. Beyond this, though, the Commission emphasized that it was really important that systems have clear and appropriate decision-making rules for choosing programs for classroom instruction and tiered intervention, and for matching students to those programs. So it was really important that boards, for example, use clear decision rules, maybe standard score cutoffs, instead of less valid or reliable measures like students having to be a certain number of years behind in their reading. The Commission also highlighted the importance of progress monitoring and outcome measures to understand the effectiveness of instruction, and also rules and guidelines for decisions on individual students within that MTSS. They also emphasize many things, but also including measures for understanding whether interventions were implemented as they were designed, and for conducting program evaluation to understand the effectiveness. And then finally, they emphasized that it was necessary for adequate resources and support to implement the interventions, including quality professional development for educators and ongoing coaching. So this was what they were hoping to find. And through the Right to Read, what did they find? Well, they found that many of the interventions used in Ontario were not evidence-based. And that when there were evidence-based programs at play, they were often used much too late, once learning gaps for students were much more entrenched. Despite tiered models, tiered instruction being a key element of provincial or board policy or strategic plans, these models existed on paper, not in practice, that there weren't those system level elements in place to support strong implementation of effective intervention. And because of this, students often endured years of ineffective supports. And then, very troublingly, student access to strong evidence-based, effectively implemented interventions often varied significantly by school board and by school as well. So, in response to these findings, what was recommended? Well, there were 14 recommendations specific to intervention, including a mandate of effective response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support with standardized evidence-based interventions available and stable protective funding to support that implementation. The Commission also emphasized that non-evidence-based interventions based on the queuing system should not be used, and that there should be data systems and program evaluations to understand the effectiveness of intervention for students and to ensure that they are meeting expectations. So with these recommendations, what I did think would be helpful would be to pop in the Commission's 2-year update to the Right to Read report, which thanks for putting that in the chat, MJ. You'll see that this report is an update on progress that has happened based on those recommendations. And what you'll see is that the Commission has highlighted how Ontario is doing in response to those core recommendations. And you'll see that reading interventions, there's still lots of room that we have to, there's lots of work we have to be done. We know that in Ontario, since the release of the report, we have seen changes to our curriculum. We have seen the implementation of universal screening, and we look forward to the implementation of the revised kindergarten curriculum this coming fall. But interventions highlight, a key area where we have work to be done. So with that, I will transition over to one of our big ideas tonight, which is intensifying instruction. How can we intensify instruction to meet the needs of our students who need additional support in developing those foundational word reading skills? So we know that interventions can be distinguished by how intense, long, and often the intervention is delivered. So this is a key piece that we're going to keep coming back to, that idea of intensifying support. And we're going to look at that through a couple of different slices throughout our time together tonight and then in our future meetings. And I thought it might be helpful to have a metaphor here. I love using metaphors to explain concepts. And this is something where when we think about intensifying instruction, it is something where we're highlighting that the same high quality instruction that is evidence-based and that can be preventative for many, 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 many of our students in core instruction in Tier 1 needs to be intensified and enhanced in Tier 2 and 3. This is not something where students who need intervention need a completely different approach. This is something where they need it to be enhanced and intensified and even more explicit, made even more explicit for them. You can think about those core elements. We can think about Superman not being an entirely different person, but that being a more intense, more explicit, enhanced version. Now, this is something I want to be clear, if core instruction, this is hinged on core instruction being high quality and evidence-based and really connected to what we know about the research. But recognizing that for our students who need more support, who need an additional intervention to develop those early foundational skills, it is something where we know they need an intensified version of that high quality instruction that is available within their core. And this is something where it is, it is really important to recognize what this looks like for alignment across the tiers. Thinking about how some of our most vulnerable students experience intensified supports. I've pulled a quote here from Stevens and colleagues, which was a research article that evaluated what was the effectiveness of having reading intervention in a school that was closely aligned with core instruction versus intervention that wasn't. And it's a helpful reminder of this piece that our students who need intervention are often our students who are most vulnerable. And if we're responding with intervention that has a different scope and sequence, maybe it uses different instructional language or prompts of how we're asking students to solve a word, this is something where we're mindful of how that could create additional confusion and cognitive load. So just being mindful that, when we think about intervention, we're very clear about taking a cohesive system approach and understanding the importance of alignment across the tiers. Now, the framework that we're going to use across our time together is one where I want to highlight how we can intensify, right? There are different ways, there are different buttons or levers we can press to intensify. And I'm going to run through all of them and then tell you what our focus is going to be this evening. So there are several factors we can push, we can amplify to make instruction more intense and more explicit for students who need additional support. So we can intensify the strength of an intervention, the dosage, how much students are getting, the alignment, how closely it's connected to their needs. We can intensify based on how it can transfer over to different contexts, how comprehensive it is, whether there's additional behavioral support for students, and how it's individualized. Now, all of these levers, all of these buttons that we can press to sort of make that good core tier 1 instruction more intense for students who need additional support. These come from a document. It's called the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity, and it was developed by the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Thanks, MJ, for putting that in the chat. And it's something where this is a handout there that links to a PDF that just briefly explains those different factors. We're going to be digging into them in much more depth together, but there are also lots of wonderful resources on that site. So if there's anything that if this is something you're interested in, I would highly recommend digging into that and exploring. So tonight our focus, you'll hear a little bit about it from me, and then you'll see it in practice from Ines, highlighting what that looks like around decision making for students. Our focus tonight will be around alignment. How can we intensify supports for students in making sure that the intervention and support we're giving students is directly aligned to their needs? And key questions to think about for this really is this idea that we want to be so mindful of how is our intervention, how well is it addressing those core students' needs? Are we really closely connected to what that most pressing academic instructional need is for that child? And on the flip side, we also want to think about, are we not addressing the skills that the student has mastered? Are we addressing that most pressing need while also not addressing those pieces that the student does not need intervention on? And this really matters because oftentimes our first inclination when we think about intervention might be to give more and to provide more and to give additional time or, lengthening sessions or maybe additional days of the week. But it's really worth highlighting this idea that giving more intervention that isn't aligned to the student's need is not going to be effective. We know that there are several different buttons we can press to intensify, and alignment is one really big piece. Now, how can alignment be challenging? Where can we see a mismatch, right? When can this be a problem? This might be a problem if we are assigning students to an intervention based on convenience, or if we have one standard intervention that we use for all students who need reading support, even though there might be individual differences in the skills that need to be targeted. This could also be a problem if we don't get down to the root cause and identify that most pressing skill that needs to be supported. You'll hear a lot from Ines about that tonight. And this is something where reading well, our end goal for students is comprehension. There are many different factors and skills that contribute to this. So you'll see I've highlighted here ONLit's Making Sense of Screening Decision Tree that highlights sort of the sequencing of skills that can contribute to that ultimate end goal of comprehension. And this is something where when we think about aligning instruction intervention to students' needs, we need to be so mindful of ensuring we're actually connecting with that most pressing need that we know students need support on. So we can align based on skill. And then even within this skill, which again, you'll hear from Ines about, but you will hear it's also really important to align based on students' level of proficiency within that skill. So you might be familiar with the instructional hierarchy. This is a series of stages that we go through when we are learning something new. And the big piece, the big takeaway to highlight is we move through a progression of learning to become accurate with a skill. So you can see students when they are in the acquisition phase, they are often inaccurate, and we're really focusing on making sure that we're building accuracy for them. We're providing lots of opportunities for them to have repetition and plenty of opportunities for them to be successful in developing that foundational skill. When students become more accurate, our focus shifts to building fluency. So we know that when students are accurate, but performance is still slow and potentially belabored, we know that instructionally our focus is on building opportunities for them to develop automaticity with that skill. And automaticity is so important because if we think about what our end goal is, we want students to be able to use these foundational skills across many different contexts and integrate them across many different elements and academic tasks. And that represents generalization and adaptation, the two final elements of the instructional hierarchy, where students are able to apply those skills that they've become accurate and automatic in, and they are able to apply them across different contexts. So, with that, I will transition over to Ines, and she will walk you through what this looks like in real life. And with that, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Una, and thank you to the ONlit community for joining us here tonight. So the first thing that I want to talk about is assessment and how students' needs are understood. The first step in deciding what Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction might look like for an individual student or group of students depends on the quality of the data that you have. We are going to take a look at universal screening, response patterns, and mastery levels, as well as diagnostic assessments and what they can tell us not only about students' needs, but about what students already know and are able to do. In my personal teaching career, there has never been a time where I've been able to access the precise data that would inform my teaching until now. Universal screening is a game changer. In addition to information about which students may be at risk, it can tell us so much more. This quote from Stephanie Stoller is so impactful. Analyzing response patterns is a critical component of the evaluation process that moves beyond mere numerical scores to inform targeted instruction. While the scores indicate if a student is at risk, the response patterns indicate why and what specific skills need intervention. So the first image here, we're going to acquaint ourselves with this image, is an image of the Nonsense Word Fluency Assessment dashboard view of student responses from Acadience for Nonsense Word Fluency. You can see in the pill bar above that this student scored 25 correct letter sounds and 0 whole words read. Green bars below represent correct responses for both individual sounds and for words read as whole words, whereas red bars with an X represent errors in sounds. The stacking of bars represents each thing a student said for each item. For example, in the third item, the student may have responded something like this: o. The stacking represents an error on the first sound, a correct response on the second sound, and then correct recoding. So this is one student's response patterns. Now let's take a look at a second student's scores and response patterns. This student scored lower, 24 correct letter sounds, but 2 whole words read. There's evidence of many correct sounds and some recoding of whole words. And finally, let's take a look at a third student's scores, exactly the same as our first student, but check out the response patterns. Consistently correct, sound by sound with consistent recoding. 3 sets of scores are all relatively similar, but based on the response patterns, which student shows the most advanced skills when it comes to word reading? What might the instructional next steps for each student be? The teacher's role is to determine what concepts, skills, and levels of support are required for each student in order to move them to automaticity and independence using the instructional hierarchy as a guide. Each of these elements increases the specificity and the alignment of the intervention to the student's specific needs. When thinking about any skill, educators should think about how it can be broken down and supported and how to fade those supports over time. The goal will always be to move students toward independent skill application. Let's take a closer look at reading words. At its most supported, we can lead students to say each sound in isolation, then blend the sounds using continuous blending, and then read the word. This can be further scaffolded by having the teacher do each step with the student. The next step may be to drop the naming of each sound before blending. Careful attention being paid to any tricky or new sounds not yet consolidated. Individual sounds can be prompted prior to blending. Moving further up the staircase, students can be prompted to blend in their heads with sufficient wait time before reading the word. And finally, moving to automatic word reading. Over time and when required, educators can move up and down the staircase as new concepts are introduced or as the complexity of the skill increases. Let's take a closer look using our sample student data from before. When we think back to the instructional hierarchy, we would recognize that this student understands the concept of blending to read, but is still building accuracy with vowel sounds and using those sounds to accurately blend and read words. While in the acquisition phase, educators engage in highly scaffolded and supported guided practice during instruction, ensuring high accuracy in responses so that all practice is virtually errorless. This is intensification both in the dosage and in the alignment. The smaller group size, alignment to student-specific needs, and teacher instructional practices all ensure that the opportunities to respond are intensified compared to the instruction in the regular Tier 1 programming. In this scenario, intervention may begin with a phonemic awareness warm-up, move to some explicit instruction using embedded mnemonics for vowel sounds, and then into word reading with continuous blending. Educators may consider starting at the bottom step with naming each sound prior to blending, or simply directing attention to the tricky medial vowel that this student requires. Looking at the first word in the grid, it may sound something like this. Look at the vowel. What sound? That's right. Ah. Blend with me. Not. Read the word. Not. Next vowel. That's right. Ah. And so on. So the teacher would guide the student and have the student focus on the direct needs that the assessment data showed. Let's take a look at student number 2. This student is generally accurate with their letter sound correspondences. This student is able to apply blending skills at times with 2 sound words and is attempting to recode some 3 sound words and seems to understand the skill and needs to work on their skills with 3 sound words to move towards fluency. So using the same core resources and continuous blending routines, the teacher's role is to support developing skills and provide prompted and guided practice with immediate corrective feedback as students begin to take on greater independence in applying their skills. Intensification is achieved through the specificity in instruction and in the students' opportunities to practice only the skills that they require as their direct next step. Students are guided through blending with initial teacher modeling, but the teacher's voice can be turned off to promote student independence with the task. The educator makes this decision because the student has already demonstrated their ability to do this at times within their response patterns of the nonsense word fluency assessment. Finally, let's take a look at student 3. This student is highly accurate and shows consistent ability to apply blending skills to whole word reading. Word reading is developing and not yet automatic. So again, we'll look at using the same core resource is being utilized and extended to help the student move through the fluency phase and apply word reading skills in context. The teacher's role is to bridge the student's strong skills into independent and automatic responses by fading scaffolds and providing both affirmative and corrective feedback as needed. These 3 examples show that although the scores are very similar and the core intervention resources may be the same, small changes in the differentiation and delivery can increase the specificity of the intervention. But what about older students with reading difficulties? Well, the same universal screeners being used in our K-2 spaces under PPM 168 are just as useful for older students. The screener can continue to help us identify which students are at risk in the older grades. For students who are well below their current grade level in reading, grade level screening materials do not tell us much about what the student can do or what their immediate next steps are for learning, which is why using out of grade level assessments that are still part of the same universal tool system can be extremely helpful. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is mastery level assessment. Well, mastery level assessment is testing back using out of grade level oral reading fluency assessments. While testing back, educators are looking for the highest level where students have shown mastery when compared to the end of year benchmarks for that level. So why would we do this? Well, first of all, it identifies a student's instructional level when it comes to word reading and fluency skills. It also help us as educators determine an appropriate level for progress monitoring. It helps us to set ambitious and achievable goals for students, and it helps us to make instructional decisions about intensifying their instruction. Let's take a look at this spreadsheet table. There's a lot going on here, so I will try to break it down. This is a spreadsheet that is designed for a grade 5 student. You can see that at the top. It's based on grade 5 Acadience data. You can see that the table begins with grade level assessments. There are spots for assessments 3 times a year: BOY, beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year. Next, we see spots for out of grade level assessments, a pre column and a post column to be used pre and post intervention. So all of the benchmarks for these out of grade level assessments are based on the end of year benchmarks for the level listed at the top of the column. Assessment would occur one level at a time, working backwards from the grade level assessments until scores obtained show mastery of that grade level skills. In this case, the scores that are at or above benchmark for both accuracy and rate in the oral reading fluency when compared to the end of year benchmark for that grade level. Assessment can stop when the mastery level is determined, and you can see in this example, level 2 is where both the accuracy and the words correct scores reached the benchmark or above benchmark level. And then instructional level would be the level is an indicator of the most appropriate level of text that should and could be used to teach decoding and fluency skills for this student. It also gives educators an idea of the level of complexity of the word reading abilities students already have control over. For example, at mastery level of 1, students are likely doing well with single syllable words and are moving into decoding simple 2-syllable words. A student with a mastery level of 2, as pictured here, would already have skills at 2 and simple 3-syllable words and would be looking at decoding multisyllabic words with more parts. Which then brings us to diagnostic assessments. Once a mastery level is determined, a phonics diagnostic assessment may be required to determine if weaknesses in accuracy or rate are a function of missing phonics and/or decoding concepts. These assessments alone may not give us a good understanding of an older student's needs. They may lead to an oversimplified view of student gaps and lead to instruction that is too easy or too hard. So let's take a look at an example. So based on this core phonics assessment overview, we can see a need when it comes to vowel teams. The next view, Una, if we can move on, here we go. This view may give us the impression that this student needs to work on these skills in single syllable words, because that is what we assessed. However, what we know is that students who are older and still struggling readers may need instruction that involves these skills at a variety of different levels. And this can be made clearer knowing where that mastery level falls. So mastery level and phonics diagnostics together help us determine not only the individual concepts that need to be taught, but also the complexity at which they need to be applied. Older students with phonics gaps cannot be held at the single syllable level and must progress to multisyllabic word instruction while learning those missing pieces of code that they require. Multisyllabic decoding in and of itself, however, can vary in its complexity, and knowing what students can do, namely the level at which they show mastery of skills, can help us as educators determine what their precise next steps are, which will ultimately support us in knowing what intervention programs might be the right fit for their needs. For example, a student with a mastery of less than level 1 will need a lot of practice with single syllable words, but can and should move immediately into 2-syllable words. In sample one, we see an opportunity for students to practice the target vowel team skill exclusively in 1 and 2 syllable words. In sample two, we can see that the same target vowel team skills, AI and AY, the skill practice becomes more complex as it's combined with the learning of affixes, and discrimination between the target vowel teams and other spelling patterns is required. So this would be more appropriate for students with a mastery of greater than level 1. So in summary, when we think about using assessment data, it needs to be used to plan for our intervention. It allows for precision, alignment, and individualization. Assessment data should inform us of what students can do and not just what they can't in order to plan for the right levels of support and complexity in our interventions and in our teaching.
So I will step back in and say that I am thrilled that we look like we'll have plenty of great time for questions, and we'd love to have some discussion around some of this content. I did want to make sure that we, did really highlight again some of those pieces where I pulled this quote from the commission as well, highlighting that when reading interventions are early, evidence-based, fully implemented, and closely monitored, they are highly effective in reducing reading failure. And I think it was a point that I just wanted to make sure we emphasize this idea that this discussion around how can we best intensify for our students has a tremendous opportunity in truly shifting trajectories for students who are at risk for significant reading difficulties, for students who have special education needs, students who rely on this type of intervention to meet their right to learn to read. And it is something where when I pull back, so this as we highlighted, these are the elements from the taxonomy of intervention intensity. Our focus today was on alignment, and I think about how I just so appreciate Ines in really highlighting those specific considerations educators can make in analyzing screening data and not just looking at the score, but more looking at patterns of how students are doing and how we can be really quite granular in making sure that our intervention meets students where that most pressing need is. So, our focus for today is alignment, but across the rest of our sessions together, we'll be focusing on additional elements of how we can intensify. So considerations around strength of intervention. Is this an evidence-based intervention that we know is going to be effective for students with this learning profile? We can think about dosage in terms of how can we amplify the number of opportunities students have to respond? How can we make this more explicit for them? How can we increase that dosage? We can think about considerations of how do we ensure that what's happening in intervention for that student, we're purposefully structuring their day so there is an opportunity for them to transfer those developing skills across different contexts. So really our focus will be to dig into different factors of how instruction can be intensified for students who need that support. So we will turn off the recording for Q&A. I did just want to highlight that our next session will be in just over a month, Monday, March 30th at 7 p.m. And that we will have plenty of time for Q&A this evening together. But if anything else pops up in the meantime, don't hesitate to send us an email at info@onlit.org. We would be happy to respond to any questions that come up in the meantime.